Good evening, everyone. I'm Gretchen Crosby-Sims, Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are incredibly honored to be welcoming Ai-jen Poo and George Goehl tonight, who are about to give us a master class in political organizing. And we are also incredibly happy to be welcoming back UChicago and IOP alumnus Osita Nwanevu, who is returning to campus in his first capacity as a moderator, and we are incredibly proud to see an IOP alum playing this role and hope more of you will in years to come. I want to mention a few upcoming events. We are hosting on Monday a conversation on the war in Yemen featuring two journalists who cover the region. Next Wednesday, May 1st, former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, William Burns, will be discussing his new book on American diplomacy. And Thursday, May 2nd, Jason Rezaian of the Washington Post will be with David Axelrod discussing his 544-day imprisonment in Iran. You can find out more about these events and others at our website at politics.uchicago.edu. And I also want to thank our partners at iHouse for our co-sponsoring this event with us. We will have audience questions after the program. We will have a microphone in this aisle right here. Please line up, and as usual, we give priority for the first three questions to students, and we remind you that a question ends in a question mark. One more note about Q&A. We have noticed that many questions at some of our events tend to come from young men. While we don't want to discourage anyone from asking a question, we want all of you to feel free to come up and ask questions. Please make sure that your phones are on silent. And here to formally introduce our speaker is Hannah Batlin. Hannah is a third year from Washington, D.C., studying sociology. This year, she is the co-chair of the Women in Public Service program at the IOP. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's event, So You Want to Build a Movement. We have three incredible people on the stage today, each with impressive knowledge of what it means to build grassroots relationships and move power on issues including labor, immigration, financial reform, and racial justice. Ai-jen Poo currently serves as the Executive Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and co-director of Caring Across Generations. One of the U.S.'s most accomplished labor activists, she has helped represent the estimated 2 million domestic workers, including housekeepers, nannies, caregivers in the United States. Her work to pass the nation's first Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights has been critical in representing women of color whose work makes all other work possible. George Goehl currently serves as the Director of People's Action, a national organizing network dedicated to economic and racial justice in the United States. As an organizer and activist, Mr. Goehl crafted numerous city, state, and federal campaigns on housing, banking, and immigration, including the 99% Spring movement. His leadership has been instrumental in organizing across rural and urban communities to create more equitable and sustainable economies. Our moderator today is Osita Nwanevu. He's an alumnus of UChicago and currently a staff writer for The New Yorker, covering politics and policy in Washington, D.C. Not only has he written for Slate and In These Times, he previously served as the editor-in-chief of the Southside Weekly, a crucial local publication made right down the street. Please join me in welcoming our panelists and moderator.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Ai-jen and George, thank you so much for being here. I guess a good place to start would be a question that I didn't really have an answer to when I first came to UChicago. What exactly is organizing? When somebody uses the word organizing, what activities and projects first come to mind for you?
Want me to start?
Yeah, sure.
First, hi everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight, and really thanks to our hosts for having us. It's really an honor to be here. The way I define organizing is bringing everyday people together to collectively develop a plan to create some change that they're affected by, on an issue that they're affected by, and to ultimately try to change the balance of power in a situation so that more power is in the hands of more everyday people. And so that is kind of how I define organizing, and organizing often expresses itself in the context of campaigns around specific issues where there's a specific goal in mind, a piece of policy you're trying to change, an elected official that you're trying to move. And I think the greatest campaigns can be incredible vehicles for transformation. I have in the past compared great campaigns to great love affairs because they're these incredible containers for transformation of people. I don't know how many of you have been a part of a great campaign? Okay, so you might know, that's a lot of you. So this is like 101 for you guys. But you might know the feeling of like, you are so busy and you have so many responsibilities, and all of a sudden you get involved in a campaign and suddenly everything changes. You look at the world really differently. You have new friends, new relationships, more things seem possible. It's like falling in love when you're so busy, you have no time for anything else. And all of a sudden you have time to make dinner and go for a walk and go see a movie, and all of a sudden time and space opens up, and so many things that you didn't see before are suddenly possible and visible, right? And that's what great organizing efforts can do for us, is change us as people as we change the world around us, and also profoundly change our relationship to the people who are affected by the issues that we're working on too. So maybe I'll stop there and let you pick it up.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Real quickly, I think to add to what Ai-jen said, like one of the most important parts of organizing is we create an arena for people who most of their lives have not felt very powerful or impactful, and have lots of messages, internal and societal, that say like, stay in your place, follow the rules, get in line. And that's really kind of diminished people's sense of themselves and power. And so we try to create an arena where people tap into their true sense of self and their true human potential. And to me, that's the most important part of what we do. And it really separates organizing from public policy or politics or other things, which are also super important, in that we transform people and transform communities and their sense of themselves. And I know for the first 10 to 15 years of organizing, I literally every 2 weeks was shocked a paycheck showed up, because I'm like, I'm getting paid to help people find some sense of themselves that they've never had before. So I'd say that's super, super important and unique to the craft. But then at the really basic level, because I think it's a great question, because I think you even said, Barack Obama becomes president, and everybody's like, community organizing is a phrase, but nobody really thinks about, knows what it is. To me, in many ways, it's like people are sitting at home, or they're in their car, they're at work, and they're upset by something. Something is frustrating about the conditions in their lives, but at the time, it's an individual grievance, and it's an individual pain. But we actually know it's a collective pain, but the job of the organizers is to move it from being lots of individuals in, South Austin or in Roseland or in some other city, and collectivize those grievances and bring people together and get a sense of their own power, put some pressure on whoever's in charge, win. And after that first victory, people's sense of what's possible completely changes.
Yeah, you talked about this a little bit, George, but we're in a season where people are obviously focused a lot on electoral politics and formal politics. That's what's on everyone's mind. What makes organizing important and distinctive as a particular kind of political activity, and how does it relate to the channels of politics people are more familiar with? I guess each of you can answer that one.
Yeah, this last week, a really important Chicago organizer, Bob von Drasek, who organized in South Austin and Chicago for 30-some years, passed away. And at his service, which I went to yesterday, they actually were quoting some stuff that Danny Davis wrote about him. And he said, like, community organizers are the canaries in the mine. They actually see the issues that are going to break out and be big issues for society much earlier than everybody else. But they're also the first responders. They're the first ones there when crisis hits, when a new issue, when the foreclosure crisis hits, when there's an immigration rate in the community. And that's a critical role that organizing plays. And yet we're in a shift right now in the organizing sector. So I come out of a history of community organizing that I guess people would call the Alinsky model, though we never sat around talking about Alinsky or anything like that, but it's somehow part of that lineage. And I would say that organizing style was largely designed to win the best thing possible within the current political and ideological landscape. It was not designed to change that landscape. And so these are the aldermen, this is the mayor, what's the best thing we can get with these clowns in charge? And so the shift that's happened over the last 10 years really in organizing has been a shift towards how do we move this base that is grounded in people's struggles and aspirations into the ballot box. And so you have really a couple $100 million sector of community organizing shifting toward electoral politics and saying we're no longer going to sit on the sidelines both in the battle around elections and governance, but also around the battle of ideas.
I would also say that the way I think about organizing and movement building is that it is about long-term changing the balance of forces and power. And I also think that there are many different kinds of power. And political power is one, like the ability to win elections, move voters, and change policy that way is one dimension of power. And there are many others. And I'd say two that are really important to us as a movement are, one, narrative power, the ability to tell the story of why things are the way that they are in the world on your terms. Essentially, the ability to define reality. And the muscles and the capacities and the things you need to do to build narrative power and shape the conversation, the public conversation and the popular culture, and kind of the deeply held beliefs and norms that help us make meaning of a really complex world. That's a really different set of muscles that it takes to win elections. There's also economic power, which is the ability to direct capital, to shape markets. That's also just a very different arena of power. And organizing can allow for everyday people to build power and to shape reality in those arenas. And they should allow us to shape all of those arenas. Mostly what people are familiar with when it comes to organizing is really about the political and the electoral. But I think what we need to be thinking is much more expansively about what it looks like to shift power, and for everyday people like us in this democracy to be able to take hold of the narrative, to be able to have a voice and shape the future of the economy and of work, right? And that's going to happen through the electoral process, and it's also going to happen other ways too.
Ai-jen, you were a leader in the effort to get New York's state domestic workers' Bill of Rights passed in 2010. But you've been organizing on behalf of domestic workers for I think over 20 years now. You started not long after you graduated from college. Mm-hmm. And when I think about organizing, I think about efforts that, one, take a long time. This is certainly one of those. And two, I think about efforts that are on behalf of communities that are at the margins of society, or people that we don't really think about, or people who are invisible in some way, and making them, building their power, as you've said. And I think domestic workers fit the bill. It's a low-income population, often population of immigrants, often often minorities. How did you decide to get involved with that particular issue in that particular community? And what was it like trying to build connections with domestic workers when you first tried to start organizing them?
Yeah, I started organizing domestic workers in 1998, and it came out of a series of experiences I had as a student and then afterwards volunteering at a domestic violence shelter in the Asian immigrant community in New York City. I was raised in part by my grandparents, and so I'm bilingual and speak Mandarin, and I used to volunteer on the hotline at the New York Asian Women's Shelter. And a lot of the hotline calls that would come in were women who were struggling, yes, with surviving violence and the struggles having to do with kind of leaving your abuser, getting the support you need, figuring out how to start over. And a lot of the calls that we got were also about working long hours and for weeks on end and not getting a paycheck, or working incredibly hard, 2 and 3 jobs, and still not being able to find housing that you can afford with your kids. And it struck me so profoundly that such a basic thing in our economy, women are working incredibly hard and still can't make ends meet, like still cannot pay the bills and raise their kids with dignity, that there is something fundamentally wrong there. And until we address that, it would be really hard to address any number of other issues, or that it certainly affects any number of other issues, everything from safety to health to housing, right, and education. And so it seemed like a key there. And I just started to talk to those women about what kind of work they're doing, where they're working, what the working conditions are like. And it just seemed clear that there had to be a way that through working together, we could address some of these issues. And one case led to another. And I really did start out organizing in the parks and playgrounds in New York City, like a package of flyers, an invitation to a monthly meeting in a church basement in Brooklyn, the third Saturday of every month, for years, just talking to workers on the street about their experiences, their stories, and if they knew that there was an organization for them. And people would come, and every year a few more. And it got to a point where word got around, and all of a sudden we didn't have enough chairs for the meeting. And I think that the big lesson there is that it does take time, but then there are these breakthrough moments, these moments of momentum, and you don't always know when they're going to happen, when they're going to come. And when they do come, it's really critical to seize those moments and really try to make transformative, bold change. We organized for years before we were ready to launch our statewide campaign for the first Bill of Rights. And that campaign actually took 7 years before we won. But after that first win in New York, all of a sudden states around the country called us. Workers all over wanted to know how they could pass a Bill of Rights in their state, and all of a sudden there was organizing from 3 states to 12 states to 20 states. And now here it is at 2019, and we have 9 states that have passed domestic worker bills of rights, and the city of Seattle. New Mexico just became the 9th state 3 weeks ago. And thank you. And we're working with Senator Harris and Congresswoman Jayapal to introduce the first national Bill of Rights for domestic workers. And we're excited about all the new organizing that that's going to support as well.
George, I believe I've read that your experience with organizing, I mean, you're in this big national organization now, and you run some of the things. But I believe I read that you started out working at a soup kitchen or helping out at a soup kitchen. Can you talk to us about what that was like and how you ended up getting involved there?
Yeah, so I grew up in southern Indiana, and coming out of high school was in pretty rough shape. And just to be blunt, was deeply addicted to drugs and super emaciated. And finally, somebody convinced me to go eat at a soup kitchen, and went a couple times. Felt, was not glad to be there, but was really glad to be fed. And I noticed, like, after I'd come a few times, I'm like, oh, there's kind of a community thing here. Like, people would grab a mop or and help clean up. There wasn't like we're the people serving you and you're the patrons. And so I started to do a little bit of that. And around the same time, a friend of mine killed herself and left me the suicide note, and said, or at least left me one of the suicide notes, and it said, if anything comes out of my passing, I hope you get your act together because you're talented, but it doesn't look like that right now. And oddly, this is a pretty strange thing to happen in southern Indiana, but the cook was Armenian. He was from Beirut, and he really wanted to do theater. And I looked pretty crazy, and he wanted me to play the boy in Equus, which is a play about a kid that stabs out the eyes of 6 horses. So I guess I had that look. And he asked me to be in this play, and I grew up, before I came to Bloomington, in a pretty rural area. I was not part of theater was like not a thing I thought of or knew of. But I was like, Jennifer said I should do something. This guy, Von Ness, has asked me to do something. I'm going to do it. And he said, I'll tell you what, he made $3.85 an hour. And he said, I'll give you half of it. If you come in and wash dishes, I'll cook. The church ladies will come, and we'll see how that goes, and we'll rehearse. And And so I said, yeah, let's do this thing. And then during the work at the soup kitchen, people started to, I was still using, just to be clear, like, but people were coming in, people needed me to show up for them. I'll never forget Tommy Fife was 75, developmentally disabled, urinated himself every day, which was not his fault. He'd pick up cigarette butts and put them together to put together a cigarette. He would always have beer smell on him from the cans he'd picked up on the way. Long story, I got my act together for people like Tommy that needed me to be able to show up and give him a job or an ear. So, and got very into the soup kitchen and was really proud. Thought like I'm doing the best work possible and really proud of where things had come. And then one day I looked up and I was literally mopping the floor at the end of a day of serving meals. And I was struck by the fact that pretty much to a person plus more people, it was the same group of people that were there the first day I came in 3 years earlier. And I didn't grow up in a political family. I didn't get, I mean, I had like some analysis, some basic level analysis stuff, but not a deep political analysis. So I wanted to, from there, figure out how to get to the root causes of poverty. And randomly actually found Saul Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals, and read it, which is actually, if you read it, is not a great manual on how you do organizing, but it gave a sense, right, everybody's like, yeah, I know. And so I had to find other books for that, but it gave you a sense that there was some other way to do it. And so we started organizing in the soup kitchen, in public housing, in the homeless shelters. And we were succeeding at getting lots of people together, but we actually didn't know enough about strategy. But somebody in Indianapolis heard about some people in southern Indiana that were kicking up some dust down south and invited us up there. And there was this guy who actually, at this point in my life, I was very skeptical of his three-piece suit. But he kept saying, power concede nothing without a demand. He had a whole thing around strategy. So we invited him down to southern Indiana. We said, well, look, we got enough money to pay for your gas and feed you. That is it. And he came down, and we totally, a number of us totally got it. And we created a poor people's organization in southern Indiana, put a lot of pressure on the mayor and city council, and won what at the time was the most progressive housing trust fund in the country. And that was 96 or something, and I haven't looked back. Yeah.
You know, you both started out pretty young, or youngish. And you know,
You're not going to ask.
I'm not going to ask. But when you're a young person looking to make a difference, I think one of the easiest things to do is to sort of look at the established channels. It's, I want to get involved. I'm going to go vote. I'm going to work on a campaign, or I'm going to go work for a nonprofit or volunteer somewhere. And I think that organizing seems like it takes a little bit more initiative. You might be the only person in the park handing out flyers. You might be one of the few people in the soup kitchen. It's like a less, it requires a bit of confidence that might not be there when you first look to get involved. And I was wondering if each of you could talk about what it was like building that kind of initiative and working on something that was not as established as other channels of making a difference or getting involved in community.
Well, one of the things I'll say about organizing that is amazing is even when you're taking extraordinary risks, you're always doing it as a group with other people. And that makes taking risks so much, I won't say easier, but it just makes it a fundamentally different experience because you're doing it together with other people. And the act and choice of doing that in and of itself is also transformative, and you're never really losing, because even when you fail, even when you lose a campaign, you've learned so much, and those relationships that get formed in the course of organizing are just irreplaceable. The experiences that you share when you're organizing with other people are bonds that really stay with you for life, I think. And so it just allows for you to take extraordinary risks and venture into the unknown, knowing that you'll never be alone, which is really hard in other professions. A lot of times you are on your own, and it's a very competitive environment. The whole principle of organizing is collective action, collective power, culture that's about how we actually build deeper transformative relationships. So I think that I do also think that there's less that's known in our popular culture about organizing. Barack Obama was amazing for our field because all of a sudden people were like, my mom, I could be like, that thing. And she'd be like, okay, but what is it? So we still had challenges, and we still do today. My grandmother is like, is it social work? 30 years in. But I do think that once you're in it, you see there's like a whole universe of amazing people who do it too, and who are working on all kinds of issues, every issue under the sun. And we're actually living through one of the greatest organizing moments certainly of my lifetime, and I think of several generations where all of a sudden everybody's asking, what more can I do and who can I do it with? And so I think this is the moment for organizing. We're in the middle of an organizing renaissance in a way. Everyone is kind of stepping up their activism and their civic engagement. And I think the more people we can move towards organizing and building lasting power that is about preserving, protecting, and enhancing our democracy and democratic engagement on all the issues that we care about in our communities, the better. So that's what I would say is like, even if it doesn't feel like that many people understand it now, we're headed into a moment where we're going to be like main stage, center stage.
We're getting close.
We're getting close.
Yeah. Should I answer the same question, or you?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know the answer, but I'm going to try to play with one. Like, I think like some mix of like either anger, frustration meets technique to some extent. So like if you're angry and frustrated, but you actually don't know what to do, there's a horrible place to be. But really there's some basic skills, and I think of organizing as like kind of a bit of wondrous craft. But once you learn some of those techniques and skills, and you're angry and frustrated with the way things are, you feel a lot of responsibility to use them. For all the talk of why don't people want to get involved, or people don't care, like I found if you actually go out and talk to people and ask them what they want to work on, which is actually a key part of organizing, not us mobilizing people around what we're energized around, but what people say when we knock on their doors or do a one-on-one or show up at the place of worship or the soup kitchen or whatever. But techniques around identifying what people's self-interests are, why they want to move, techniques to help people tap into their own power, techniques like conducting a power analysis to figure out how we're going to create the change, techniques like creating a campaign plan. I think if you're truly frustrated on things and you know that stuff, you kind of feel a sense of responsibility to move it forward. And I will say some of the best organizers I know, they are drivers. They are people that kind of will things to happen. Things that probably aren't going to happen, they just will them to happen over and over.
I've thought so many times since the election in 2016, the apocalypse of 2016, I've thought so many times how lucky I am to be an organizer, because there are millions of people who are feeling lost and scared and frustrated and angry, so many emotions, and like didn't know what they could do. And in my world, like we actually knew what to do, and we're doing it. And it's just a gift and a privilege to be able to say that, I think.
Journalism and organizing are pretty different, but I think one commonality is that in each you're often trying to build bridges with people who are very different from yourself, people in different stages of their lives than you are, and people with different problems. And it can be hard to build connections and to build trust with people who don't have a lot of reason to trust authority and outsiders and this kind of thing. So how do you think about that challenge in organizing? How did you deal with it when you first started out, each of you?
The building bridges part?
Yeah.
You're looking at me like you want me to go. Yeah.
I could go.
Okay.
I think my instinct, I'm actually an introvert by personality, and so my default is always to listen. So in some ways, organizing was a good path for me, because it's 80% listening. And so I just would listen to people and their stories and try to see the common threads in people's stories, and they're always there, always. People are driven by the same few things. the love for their families and the drive to take care of the people that they love, and the drive to feel like they can contribute and their lives have meaning and purpose. And so there's just so much there when you listen for it, that I think this building bridges thing, it always felt like just actually quite natural when you really listen. And all of our meetings are structured around people sharing their stories. In fact, we start every meeting with turning to the person sitting next to you and sharing a story about someone who took care of you and the value of that relationship in your life. Everybody has someone who took care of them, and everyone can tap into the incredible value of those relationships. And beginning from there, from the place of an experience that we all share, talking about our differences is actually not that. It creates a really different context for that. So I think it's the organizer's job to create that context, to listen for the common threads, and also to honor the differences in ways that, so that people do actually feel seen, and people do start to see how differences are also part of our strength collectively.
Yeah, I think obviously we're in a moment that we need to build some bridges, like maybe at a more scaled level than we have before. Just going to tell a story about some work we've been doing in Iowa that I think gives it, like, kind of illustrates what it looks like. So we've been organizing in Iowa for a long time. One of the key issues out there is a major influx of factory farms, which has been happening for 15 years, but it keeps accelerating. In these factory farms, there's 10,000 factory farms now in Iowa that produce the equivalent amount of waste of 65 million people, and so completely pollutes the air and the waterways and really change the quality of life in a county. Actually, I've got a piece that's going to come out in The Guardian about this tomorrow, kind of calling on presidential candidates in the Democratic primary to take this on as an issue. But I was out there. I've been meeting with the folks and organizing with the folks in Iowa for years. And we're having a meeting where a bunch of, like, longtime members are reflecting on their work over the last 10, 20 years together. And there's one farmer that's, like, just a tough customer. And I'm actually fairly popular with this group in Iowa, but apparently not with this guy. I just can't seem to win him over. And but so it comes around to him, and it's like, what's been your transformative moment in being part of this organization? And he's like, well, I remember when Hugh Espy, who was the director of the organization, kind of sent out a letter saying that and it's a very white organization, not like exclusively white, but it's a white statewide organization, said that we need to have a project specifically around organizing and engaging the increasing Latino population in the state, and that will mean work on immigration issues. And that had come out of some process. And so this guy said, well, I think some people around here are going to have a little bit of trouble with that. And then he said he'd meditated on it for a couple of days. He's like, I think I might be one of those people. But then he thought about all the work that had happened in the organization where he had learned, like they had gone down to Central America to see how their farming issues related to people in Central America, how much the organization had showed up for him for what was right, and how much the issues of immigration and other kinds of discrimination actually are similar but different to what he was facing. And he came to the conclusion, like, you know what, if we don't do this, everything we've done up till now is a lie. And that's one person, but that's the kind of shift in people's worldview that we're able to make through organizing, by getting people in a room, by building trust and moving people through process. And we think we're in a moment we got to figure out how to do a hell of a lot more of that, and quick.
You both have transitioned from organizing at like a very local level of the course of your career to like this macro level. You're heading up big organizations. You're now organizing the organizers. And what has that transition been like? I mean, moving from a place where you're one-on-one with these groups on the ground, or these people you're trying to work with on the ground, to leading these big groups. I mean, how did you manage that transition, and what are some of the challenges that come with scaling up this work?
Well, you have to learn the terrain of power at these different levels pretty quickly. And sometimes it takes years of trying to win something to really understand what it will take, how little power we have. So that is a constant learning journey. But I really feel like in this age, things are changing so quickly. Everything from culture and how technology is shaping our lives to the world of work. Like we're just in this the middle of a really transformative period in our economy and our demographics and our culture. And I just think we have to be ready to reinvent ourselves as people with these values and people who are leading these organizations. I think one organizational form or culture it's like, I think we have to really be like a startup all the time. And that's kind of how we've structured our organization, is to constantly be trying to learn and stretch and grow and reinvent ourselves to meet the moment and to change with where people and the culture are. And so an example of this is we started getting wind that technology was really starting to change the way that people were connecting to caregivers and like coming into our industry. Like all of a sudden we kept hearing about this care.com thing. How many of you have interacted with care.com in some kind of way? Yeah, okay. So there's like now like dozens of platforms in the care industry that are all trying to optimize how families find care. And in every sector, and all of a sudden Uber, and so we realized early on that technology had the power to transform our sector, and we really wanted to try to understand that and see what opportunities there would be to actually leverage technology to make these jobs better jobs, or to organize workers, right? It's so hard to aggregate a workforce or to organize a workforce that's hidden behind closed doors. Like you could go into any neighborhood and not know which homes are also workplaces. There's no marking anywhere or sign. So just the power of technology was completely unknown in terms of what it could do for our workforce. And so we launched an innovation lab, almost like a startup, where we brought in a bunch of technologists and designers and engineers to help us design tech tools and imagine partnerships with tech companies that would allow us to try to make the jobs that these platforms were creating better jobs, right? Living wage jobs, potentially with benefits. And then we just decided, and that we tried that for a while through partnerships, and it kind of like, it worked in some ways and didn't in others. We were like, let's try something else. And we've decided to build our own benefits platform. So we actually just launched the first ever portable benefits platform for domestic workers. It's called Aliyah, and we tested it in New York for a year, and it just went national in December. And it's the first time that domestic workers can get access to things like paid time off, life insurance, accident insurance, disability. So we keep trying to reinvent ourselves in ways. And so it always feels like we're starting over, but I think in ways that are really exciting and teach us. They force us to grow and evolve in our strategies in really helpful ways.
I was way happier on the ground. I'm just gonna be really frank. Like, it was a way better job for me. You know, like, so I deeply miss being connected to members and in the neighborhoods every day. So there was a period, you know, I said there was a period I couldn't believe the paycheck showed up. Now I definitely like, there better be a paycheck. Like, this is being in charge is a different thing. So, and I think it's a weird thing about community organizing, because a lot of us we didn't go to school for it, or maybe some people did, but I think, and then if you're any good at it, then you wake up and you're suddenly the director, and then an auditor's coming in, and you're meeting with some lawyers, and you gotta have a board, and you're like, what? Where did I make a wrong turn? This is just for me, so that's my answer. If I could go back, and I'd figure, every time there's like a organizer job posted in our organization, I'm like, could I apply for that? But no, it's just the truth. Yeah.
So for each of you, who are some of the organizers, and what are some of the movements over the past 10 or so years that have really inspired you and have been really instructive for each of you?
Well, my mentor is a woman named Linda Burnham, who started the Third World Women's Alliance and the Women of Color Resource Center. And she comes out of this tradition of women of color organizing and feminism. So that's been really, really, it's shaped me quite a bit. And so the idea of intersectionality that more people have been talking about lately, this idea that when you understand, to truly understand how power operates in the world, you have to look at it through many different lenses, race, class, gender, all of these different lenses in order to really see a full picture of how power is shaping our lives. That kind of tradition of understanding the world and then the activism that helps us leverage that understanding into social change is the tradition that I was kind of raised in, which is why organizing domestic workers has been such a dream, because we really are at the intersection of so many different experiences in the world, of work, of gender, of race, changing demographics, changing generational demographics, everything. That, and I would say that my Shiro organizer is probably Ella Baker.
What about you, George?
Let's see, so the founders of what's now People's Action. So People's Action grew out of like neighborhood organizing that was happening in the late 60s and early 70s in Chicago. And at this point, it was very kind of parochial and very like small neighborhood organizing groups didn't work together. And so Shell Trapp was a Methodist minister who went down to Alabama to integrate a church and got arrested. And when he got back, you know, the hierarchy in the church was like, you know, this isn't a path to a church in the suburbs. And he was like, church in the suburbs? Like, that's what we're talking about here? Like, that's the... So he quit the church. And he ended up applying for 2 jobs. Luckily, he got one as a community organizer in South Austin. And then Gail Sincata, who was a mother of 6, who, as Austin, which was primarily a white ethnic neighborhood and turning black, and the blockbusters were trying to create division around race, Gail Sincata said, we found the enemy, it's not each other, it's the mortgage companies and the blockbusters that are trying to divide us. They ended up organizing a big protest down at the head of the Chicago HUD office. And the guy from HUD came out and he's like, you guys can keep coming down here, but I've done everything I have the power to do. You got to go to Washington, D.C. And they were proud they'd build a citywide coalition. Like going to D.C. had never occurred to them. So depending on who tells the story, they went to a church or a bar and said, what are we going to do? But they knew that these housing issues and blockbusting, racial discrimination and redlining were happening all across the country. And so a bunch of organizers went up to O'Hare Airport and looked through all the phone books for anything that sounded like organizing. Block clubs, neighborhood, and they created the first ever national community organizing like mailing list. And they sent out a mass mailing and they did tons of phone calls, and thousands of folks from all across the country came and formed what later became National People's Action around these issues. And I think what it is about Gail, I mean, Shell Trapp was probably the best agitator of people I'd ever seen. He could go down and show up in Wichita, Kansas in a church basement with this many people, and within 40 minutes have them on a bus to go do a protest that wasn't even planned before he got there. I mean, he really did it all the time. When I was on staff with Shell for a while, and we'd come in to give our reports from going on the road, and I'd be like, you know, people would be like, I trained 20 people, I did this. He's like, oh, we took 150 people to Slumlord's house. And you're like, oh, okay. And then Gail Sincata was the first female director of any of the community organizing networks in this country, and was like a big, crazy dreamer. She had big ideas about change. She was not afraid of power. And so I just learned a ton being around them. Lucky he was just old enough to get to hang out with them.
Awesome. George, earlier you talked a good bit about Saul Alinsky and the extent to which your organizing was or was not influenced by Rules for Radicals, which may not be a good organizing manual as good as it is as a, as a book. But when the 3 of us were talking a couple of days ago, you mentioned that each of you comes from a different sort of philosophy of organizing. You were influenced by Alinsky. You were influenced, I think, in another direction. Can you talk a little bit about that and the sort of schools of thought that have guided you in the abstract?
I mean, just quickly, I think I was really influenced by activists and organizers who came out of the racial justice movements and campaigns of the 1970s. And so one of my first mentors was in the Puerto Rican movement in New York City. And so I just learned a lot about, they were the third world liberation movements. And so it was always very global in scope in terms of their perspective, but then always deeply connected to an understanding of how racism was shaping all of our institutions and our systems, and then later on, much more about feminism too. So I think it's, in terms of the organizing traditions, that tradition is more of a movement-rooted tradition that believes in mass social movements and their potential to transform our democracy and update them, right? As opposed to a more kind of neighborhood-based movement that, or organizing model that I think George's tradition comes out of.
Yeah, and I think, though we never sat around growing up going, we were like Alinskyeites or anything, but it was, I mean, you know, it got referenced and stuff, but I would say like key characteristics of that organizing and that grew out of it was tapping into people's, identifying people's self-interest. Like, what is it that's going to get people to move? So when we knock on doors, you're trying to figure out what's the thing somebody was probably fuming about on the couch when you got there, and figure out what that is and how to collectivize it across the neighborhood. Incredible at developing leaders, turning people from feeling very victimized by what's going on into powerful leaders in the community, and very good at figuring out who had power and how to move them, and fairly aggressive in the kind of actions that people would move. So great at all of that. It was also, I mean, I don't want to say this about the whole Alinsky model, but a lot of it was like thin in terms of race analysis, certainly didn't have much of a global perspective, and certainly, with a few exceptions, like had made a decision to sit out electoral politics. And so I think the big shifts we're trying to make in the model now is to actually, the way we would say it is that we want to win the battle of big ideas, which is inform how people are making meaning around what's happening in their lives, particularly around race, the role of government and markets. Second, elections can happen to us or for us, and we think they need to happen for us. And finally, having a sharper eye for structural reforms. How do we win things that actually mean we fight the next battle on stronger terrain? And I would say those have been the biggest shifts in the craft.
Cool. I think I have one question before we go to students. And I guess it would just be, what do you think are some of the most important organizing causes in this particular political moment? You talked about some of the rural organizing you're doing now. Ai-jen, I know you're doing work to organize women of color ahead of the election. Can you talk about what you think some of the issues organizers should focus on right now?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say we're always looking for gaps, like where there's just holes in terms of what's being done. And so as Trump started to ascend in 2016, you know, we do rural organizing, but to be honest, more of our investment has been in urban communities, you know, for a good while. So we decided that we actually had to run a big organizing drive in rural America, and we looked at 3 places. Counties, what people call kind of Obama to Trump counties. So there's 700 counties in the United States that voted for President Obama twice. A third of those swung to Trump in 2016, and many by 20 to 30 points. I mean, huge swings. And the highest concentration of those is along the Mississippi River, bleeding into Iowa and Wisconsin. The second criteria was places just in deep economic decline and need help. And we feel like as progressive people, if we are who we say we are, if people are hurting, we want to be there. And then the third lens was where there was a visible uptick in white nationalist organizing, and we felt like we needed to have like an opposition force to those places. So we just finished 10,000 conversations with people in rural communities across partisan lines, asked people what issues they care about most, what they think the solutions are, and then finally who and what they think is responsible for the conditions in their community, which is really when we learn about how people are making meaning of this. And we have this project running in 15 states. It is multiracial organizing. There's certainly a myth in this country of rural is kind of synonymous with white, so which is not true. We actually just had a big meeting the other day about a rural Latinx organizing strategy in the Southwest. I could say more about it, but it feels like a unique thing that somebody needed to do. And I would just, we were talking about this earlier, in organizing, like say you're doing organizing somewhere in Chicago, like you end up running into another organizing group. And you know, there used to be turf battles here like crazy, and people, I mean, these turf battles, when I go to other cities, like we got turf battles, like you don't, in Chicago, we do turf battles, like basically like mob trained. You know, I mean, it's like some just people are a little too intense about the turf battles here. But in the in the rural organizing, the only people we run into are white nationalist groups knocking on doors. And they are on college campuses. They are handing out flyers offering relief to opioids. And they're setting up hurricane relief centers like in the Southeast. So we're very clear on who we're competing with in those areas. And it's a battle.
I want to just say that I think that that work is some of the most important work in the country right now, and the fact that they're really the only ones out there doing it is an indication. And I hope that some of you, if you come from communities like that, after the 2016 election, George actually got a ton of calls from organizers who come from rural communities or small towns, and they were basically like, we think it's time to go home and organize there. And that's the kind of thing that is going to be required of us if we're to get out of this mess long term that we're in, where we're so vulnerable to division and hate and a hateful kind of politics. But so for me, our focus as domestic workers is on two fronts. One is kind of looking at the long view of what's happening in the world and in the economy in particular. There's a lot of talk about automation and artificial intelligence and what that's going to mean for the workforce of the future. And one of the things we've been looking at is there's a lot of predictions on that front, and the truth is we don't actually know what is going to happen, really. We can make some predictions, but there may be some jobs that disappear and also others that emerge, and we don't totally know what's going to happen. But one thing we do know for sure is that we're going to need people to take care of our children and our aging parents and our grandparents. We also know for sure that because of advances in healthcare, people are living longer than ever before, an average of 20 years longer than they were when we first put our safety net into place. And the baby boom generation is starting to age at a rate of 10,000 people per day turning 70 in America. And so we're about to have this huge older population and a huge explosion in the need for care. And it's already driving growth in the care workforce, so much so that the home care workforce in particular is always one of the fastest growing occupations if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the average wage for a home care worker right now is $10 per hour. And there's not enough funding in our public programs to actually pay people to do that work full time at $10 per hour. So most people can't get enough hours of work. So the annual median income for a home care worker is $13,000 per year. These are going to be a huge share of these are jobs that can't be outsourced, right? And literally, they've been trying to build a robot in a lab in Los Angeles to fold a towel for 11 years. And they have not been successful.
Just around the corner.
So I think these jobs, we know these jobs are here to stay. What an amazing opportunity to transform them into great jobs that you can take pride in and support your family on and actually restore the American dream, just like we once did with manufacturing jobs. In the 20s and 30s, manufacturing jobs were dangerous, poverty wage jobs that a lot of immigrant women did, and we transformed them into good jobs that created economic security for generations to come. And that's the opportunity here. So we're trying to figure out as the Domestic Workers Alliance, how do we spark a movement of people who care about care, which should be all of us, because we all are going to either have parents to take care of our kids, or both usually, right? To actually transform the entire care infrastructure to make these jobs good jobs and make care much more affordable and accessible for everyone. So we've got this big idea called universal family care that we're working on and trying to build support for around the country. The idea that there should one day be a social insurance program that everyone contributes to, that everyone can benefit from, that helps you afford child care, elder care, and paid family leave. Basically everything you need to take care of your families while you're working. So we're pretty excited about that idea, and we're finding that more and more electeds around the country, especially candidates who are looking to distinguish themselves, are interested in learning more too. And I think it's a huge opportunity for big, bold ideas like that, and we're putting that one out there in the field. And then we're mobilizing women voters, especially women of color voters. We have a 501c4 sister organization called Care in Action, and we did a major program in Georgia last year to Care in Action endorsed our very first candidate, Stacey Abrams, for governor. And I think Stacey, if you haven't heard of her already, you will hear of her soon. She's going to be continuing to rise as a star on the scene. And we were really proud to mobilize about 250,000 voters in Georgia last year. And we're going to be doing big, large-scale voter mobilization work like that in 15 states between now and 2020. So we're really excited about that. All focused on women of color voters and a care agenda.
Great. I think it's time now for student questions then. So if you've got any, here's a mic in the center.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a master's student in political science. Thank you all for being here. Really enjoyed the discussion. I was wondering if each of you guys could share a time where you were working on a particular organizing campaign or a certain goal and you failed, or the organizing effort failed in whatever that word means to you, and what you learned from that experience. Maybe you didn't reach a goal, or maybe it just didn't look like you thought it would. Yeah, however you want to interpret that.
That's a great question.
Yeah. Does something come to mind?
Which one? Which failure? No, which failure? I'm trying to think of I'm trying to think. I mean, what's coming to mind for me actually is the first time a campaign took much longer than I thought it would. So I don't know if it's not the best answer, but I will say, like, we were in a campaign when Andrew Cuomo was the head of HUD around federal housing foreclosures. And, I had been doing neighborhood organizing. We usually win things for 6 months or a year. But to go through an experience where you pulled people all across the country into a campaign around an issue, around people who had basically been ripped off on federal housing loans through the mortgage companies. And a couple years in, I was like, I don't know if we know how to win this. Like, I was pretty sure, like, we just, and we'd done all kinds of actions. We'd protested lots of HUD buildings. We'd been on national TV. We'd been in the media. And I think for me, it was kind of a dark period of feeling like, that's the thing about organizing, you're messing with people's lives and you're pulling them into something. And to feel like, wow, I actually think I don't know how we're going to bring home the bacon on this one, was just new. And I think I learned from that you got that we are in a long haul fight, and there are going to be ups and downs, and that you actually got to learn to expect 7, 10, 20, 30, and 40-year campaigns. But until I went through one of those myself and really questioned whether we were going to win, didn't know how to do it. And, eventually got my, kind of did a little bit of this, and we got it together and we won. But I think it's just part of the growing up of going through stuff you've never been through before.
I would say that when we first started our California Domestic Worker Bill of Rights organizing, it was a 3-year effort, and they actually had started, it was like 5 years, but we were finally, after 3 years of intense campaigning, we were finally able to move the legislation through both houses of the legislature. And it was really tough. It was a time when most legislators didn't know what we mean when we said domestic worker. So the level of education was so steep. And then there were so many elected officials that we had to organize. And we didn't have any political power. We weren't like unions who had lobbyists, and we didn't have any of that. We just had a whole bunch of women who were really passionate and who really believed in the value of their work. And frankly, most of us didn't have a lot of legislative campaigning experience, but we got through. We had already won in New York, and we got through both houses of the legislature, and we were celebrating. And then the governor at 9:00 p.m. on the very last day that you can sign a bill into law after it's come to your desk, like midnight is the cutoff, at 9 p.m. he vetoed the bill. So literally, I mean, we thought that that would be a possibility, but we kind of just couldn't believe it, you know? And we hadn't totally prepared for that experience, both emotionally and also tactically. So it was almost like paralysis for a minute, and it did take us a while to like pick ourselves up off the floor and say, okay, we're gonna keep doing this. And what we learned is only gonna make us stronger, and all the things you tell yourself when you go through something really, really hard. It took us a while. We were in paralysis for a bit. And that was pretty devastating, but let me tell you what, we have never again had another veto in this state. And certainly it's totally likely that we could, but we would be really prepared for that scenario.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm in the political science department of the college. Sorry. My question is for you, Ai-jen. And as a woman, and a woman of color especially, have you ever had moments where someone has undermined your authority or your position, and how have you dealt with that? And then how do you wish allies would have helped you in that moment?
Wow, what a great question. Bless you. Especially the second part. So let's see. Yes. So I think all the issues that we know are true in terms of how, like pay equity issues, like the fact that women get paid like half as much and aren't respected and aren't seen as the kind of leaders with vision and strategy and all that kind of, that all plays out even in the progressive movement too. And I had a friend actually in philanthropy who told me that she worked as a program officer, and then she's kind of gone back and forth on both sides of being in the field and also being on a program officer at a foundation. And she said that the most amazing thing to watch was the people who would come through to pitch their ideas, and you would have to get funding, and you would have a white guy who would come in with kind of a half-baked idea and a 3-page, poorly researched concept note and ask for $1 million. And then you'd have the woman who would come in with like a 20-page, footnoted, well thought through, all the deliverables, right? And ask for $250,000. And when she told me that story, it really did reflect everything I know to be true about how undervalued women of color are, and even just the work of domestic workers, how it's not even recognized as work. Can you imagine millions of people working in our economy and it's called the help, right? And so just that kind of realization about how sometimes we also reinforce our own marginalization by undervaluing ourselves and not asking for more, and not kind of saying our ideas and our leadership and our vision is worth a lot, not just for us, but for everyone, right? Mm-hmm. That realization was, that story that my friend told me really helped crystallize that for me. And so now I just like ask for millions of dollars all over the place. I'm like, my idea is at least as good as that guy. And I think it's really important that she told me that story, I can tell other people, and that we support each other to both make our ideas better and our work better, but also to remind each other not to undervalue ourselves, and to show each other in the way that we treat each other how much we do value each other. And so one thing I always tell people to do is like make a list of 5 women whose leadership you really want to lift up, and make a list, 5, 10, and like one small or big thing you could do to really support their leadership. And then just go through the list and do those things, you know?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Olivia. I'm a third year in the college. My question surrounds like post-2016, the organizing arena. Post-2016, as I've seen it, the organizing arena has become huge. And as a result, there's a lot to care about. And I think for young people, we oftentimes get like wrapped up in we have to care about everything all the time. And as a result, it's one, very exhausting, and two, you can't put all your effort in a meaningful place. So my question is twofold. The first being, how do you deal with empathy on this huge scale where there's so much to care about? And two, how do you maybe focus your efforts on one thing? And I guess what's your advice as to finding a place to start?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you already know. Like, in some ways, it is. No, it is like, I mean, I would say, one, we want to focus on power because that's what's going to solve all the issues that we care about. And it's something, power is like a tough word for a lot of us to deal with, but I think that's the biggest thing standing between where we are and where we want to be. So I'm making guesses about what the issues are that you care about. And I do think focus matters. I think it's great to be empathetic about a lot of things, but I do think the people that I see are the most effective actually pick off one or two or three things and really go hard on it. And then I see other people, some of which are on our payroll, who spread themselves really thin and move lots of things about a half an inch. So I feel like you've got the instinct, which is like, care about all of it, but got to hone in on a few things. You have a way more impactful life.
Yeah, and sometimes when you focus your energy kind of, I like this, I don't know how many of you are into improv, but there's this improv metaphor or concept called the ensemble. And what I love about the ensemble is that it's like, the idea is that everybody has their thing that they bring to building a house. That's the metaphor. It's like, you bring your hammer, and I'll bring the brick, and she'll bring the, and the way that I think we're going to be most powerful is like, if you're focused on climate change, and I'm focused on care, and this person is focused on, and then we're all bringing our piece into this ensemble that is trying to imagine a new future along all of these dimensions. Like that's, I think we got to think about it like an ensemble. And you don't have to work on everything to be a part of building a house that is everything.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Davis. I'm a fourth year in the college studying economics and history. And what I wanted to hear about a little more is about the sort of like organizing tactical differences between urban and rural organizing, and in particular, why, like how we've seeded the field so much, like why we're so bad at it now, what are the big obstacles, and what we can do to overcome that.
Seeded what? The rural in particular? Or?
Yeah, like that it's only like your organization and white nationalist organizations, that there's so little competition to organize in rural spaces.
Yeah, okay, couple things first, and then Ai-jen, you should, I mean, you're like in this too, is, I just say well, I just have to say this, because like coming out of Trump being elected, there was this whole question about the white working class, and it still lingers, and I just think I got a couple things we need to think about there. Like I actually don't like using the frame, and you didn't use it, but the white working class, unless we're going to be like equally committed to speaking to the black working class, the Latino working class, the Native, and the Asian, because then we're like attaching the idea of work to white people and to nobody else. I just think that's something. I think we're actually making progress, at least in the circles I run. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons we seeded the turf. I mean, I think one, a lot of people that want to do progressive work and organizing work do move to cities. So I think that's been an issue. I do think philanthropy, strategically or not, started to like disinvest in funding in rural organizing and rural infrastructure and rural institutions. And then I think big parts of the Democratic Party has actually pulled up roots and not there. So some of these were decisions made on what I would probably call a bad strategy, and some of them were just decisions made kind of in a vacuum or kind of poorly. So that's my take on why we've done it or how we've gotten to this point. I think what's trickier now is, so I should say when we knocked on these 10,000 doors, like one of the main things we heard from people was, nobody's ever asked me before. That was like one, nobody's ever asked me. And then nobody knocks on my door, and especially not Democrats. So they just like saying they just haven't heard from anybody. So I think the question is like, how do you make the choice? And I feel like this is, this is a nonpartisan room and space, but I think like progressives have to decide, do we care about the hurt in rural communities first? It should be humanitarian first, not political. And I think we have to make a decision around whether we care. That would be the first reason to like kind of set up shop and re-engage there. And then the second would be, do we want to be involved in meaning making? Because if we are not there to help people make meaning of the declining conditions of their lives, I describe the other people that will be. And then if you believe that we need to move the country in a progressive direction, or certainly not in the direction that Trump has it going, will it work in elections? And I should say from 2016 to 2018, white rural women swung 17 points from Trump to Democrats. And did I ever say this? I spoke a lot today. Did I say it in this room? I can't remember. Okay, and millennials swung 16 points from Trump to Democrats. So, I wasn't there to make the decisions around why we left. I think right now we have to build the case that going back is for those three reasons, but I think it will result in electoral outcomes. You want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I think about a lot is, I heard a speaker at the Obama Summit, the inaugural Obama Foundation Summit a couple of years ago, who really stuck with me. His name is Anand Giridharadas, and he asked a question of the room, which I thought was really important and profound. His question was, is there room among the woke for the still waking? And I think we have to create a culture of organizing and movements and politics where there is actually room. And not only is there room, but we're designing for the still waking. We're optimizing the experience of politics so that people who are still waking can see the potential of all of what this democracy can offer, and especially if they're activated and engaged. And so I find that helpful, that question helpful to constantly ask myself and rooms that I'm in, because it's so easy to surround yourself. And sometimes I get really tired, and just want to be with people who agree with me, because sometimes that's just what happens. But that's not going to be how we win in the end.
Those are really great points. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so I just want some clarification and just some understanding. So I guess maybe I'm the only person in the room that wasn't surprised that Trump won, because we've had Barack Obama, Bush,
Yeah.
Clinton. I mean, I don't understand why he's so different than everyone else. If you follow policy, it's not like we had all these rights for people and all these other things, and now, I guess policy-wise, his social issues might be different. We're all different, but I don't see anything as far as accountability for our money being any different in any administration. I guess social issues, fine. I mean, we all feel different ways, but I don't see any difference, and I don't see really any of the parties that are coming up, Democrat, Republican, that could really offer any difference, because they keep it on a social level, because we'll always disagree on social things, of course. But my question, as far as putting that into a movement, I heard you say that that there's three types of power. There is the power of narration, there's economic power, and then there's legislative power. Now, you said that legislative power has taken you so long to accomplish very small strides in legislative power. And to move legislative power, you've got to get a story told to the people who make the laws, correct? So you're not really convincing the people who have the narrative, because you don't have to convince the working class people like all of us that we're doing bad and that we need economic help. So you're really trying to take your narrative and convince it to the people making the laws. So if without having any tremendous changes legislatively over decades, Nobody's been different. I mean, maybe I'm the only one that feels that way, but it wouldn't have mattered to me who would have won. It's executive power, and executive power has remained the same for a very long time, right? Without putting more focus on quicker changes legislatively, if you're already not even optimizing that, how can this move be toward changing someone's narrative or changing economics when really changing legislation is the quickest way to achieve a shift in economics and a shift in the way people not even think, just getting people with, I guess, your narrative in more of that type of legislative power. So, you know, why narrative power? Why economic power versus optimizing legislative power and trying to not take 7 years to get rights for workers? I mean, it just seems like that's not even optimized. Now it's like, you know, let's bring in all these other powers.
Well, I would say it wasn't legislative power, political power.
Political power, same thing.
Legislative power.
Politics run legislation.
Is connected first as a part of political power. I would say this. I would say that the kind of legislative win and the time horizon of the win is a direct reflection of the amount of power that you've built. And so for us, it took us 7 years because domestic workers actually didn't have hardly any power. Even though we were organizing, even though we had members, even though we had really strong leaders and a beautiful vision, we were not powerful enough to win change in a year. Some people are. You know, some organizations
I don't mean to interrupt you, but you're not really, my question is this: how can you create change in those arenas without legislative power? What is economic and narrative power going to do without legislative power? And why, without working with a bunch of groups to optimize changes in legislative power, would you then say, well, hey, now we're shifting over to narrative and, you know, economic power, when in reality, legislative power holds really everything?
Yep.
Or
I would say this.
Say.
What I was saying is that it's not either or. It's actually like we need to build power on all fronts. And sometimes building power in the narrative arena or in the economic arena can actually help escalate the power you're able to build in the political arena or increase. And a good example of this is, to me, that we were able to win the policy change in healthcare way before we were able to win the narrative. And I think we're still struggling around the narrative around healthcare in this country. And therefore, the policy win is still very vulnerable. And so that's the reason why I think all of these different arenas of power and change are really important for us to have strategy around. I'm not saying narrative or economic is more important than political, but I think it's all actually very important to have intentional strategy and work around.
Hello, my name is David. I'm an alumnus of the Divinity School, and I've been involved with a few labor organizing drives. And I have a question for you, Mr. Goehl. I was curious about the partnerships of People's National Action with like traditional labor's union. For example, like I know like National Nurses United is a huge partner. They financially support People's National Action. Locally, there's the Reclaim PAC, which has had some awesome victories in city council. So I'm just wondering, like, how did that partnership arise? How does it work practically and structurally? What's the upsides? What's the downsides? Thank you.
That's a good question. Yeah, we don't do a ton. We want to do labor partnerships, but with labor, you know, I think struggling right now, we kind of only have so many happening. But the partnership with NNU really built around kind of two things: a sense that you needed to build a new kind of what we call movement politics, a kind of bottom-up politics that's grounded in people's neighborhoods and their hopes and their dreams, and a little less about like hoping for some great candidate to show up for us, which has actually really paid off. We have our convention of 1,000 folks in Washington, D.C. Starts Sunday, and we have 200 folks that we've actually elected out of our membership who, you know, before, you know, 4 years ago never imagined running for office, and now they're running a water reclamation district all the way to the Lieutenant Governor of Wisconsin are among our members. So I think it was that partnership was out of a sense that we needed to build more of that. And the work with Reclaim Chicago was really the major pilot in the partnership we had with NNU. and I think wildly successful and played a big role in helping start to reshape the look and feel of the Chicago City Council, and so I feel really, really good about it, yeah.
Who elected the representatives for this convention? What's the process structure?
For us, for People's Action? So People's Action, we have 50 affiliated organizations. So like the group I mentioned in Iowa, Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, each of them have 2 delegates that then are on a body that elects the board of People's Action. So every year we have a delegates assembly and people vote and they put up nominations for who is on the board, who they'd like to have on the board. And then that becomes the board. And that delegates body also votes on other things if we want to make a major shift in our platform or strategy. This is actually something we instituted 2 or 3 years ago, but it's made us a much more democratic organization. It creates a lot more process, but it's right and it works. We lost.
Well, Ai-jen, George, this was wonderful, and thanks for joining us today.
One.